photographers. Time to actually show you some of the evidence of my DIY film scanning exercise. So before I actually show you the results in my computer, I want to take a little bit closer look at some of the stuff that I did. Alrighty, so as a real quick reminder, I was working with this 120 negative, and just, you guys probably know this at this point, but the more you handle these negatives, the more likely it will be that you'll mess something up. My greasy fingers, I was like scratching them, so I probably did some damage to this thing with all the kind of experimenting that I was doing, but it actually gave me kind of a cool idea for maybe another project, so we'll talk about that later. But that said, if you want to keep your negatives clean for each scan or each attempt, probably not a bad idea to try to blow off any dust that's on that negative, or if you happen to kind of grease it with a little bit of schmoo from your fingers, try to wipe that off with a microfiber cloth. So anyway, here were the kind of basics, right? I was using my Nikon D600 to do all these photo shoots. I used a fixed 50mm lens. I tried to keep the f-stop between, maybe f5 and f8, f11, somewhere in there to keep the lens pretty sharp. So the 50mm prime, and the other lens that I was using was this 60mm micro, and boy, this lens was really nice for getting up close. I'm kind of excited to take a look at comparing the 60mm to that flatbed scanner. A couple of attempts, a couple of different techniques, right? I'll show you here in a second in the video, but I literally just taped this to the window, and a window that looked out toward my backyard, just to see if I could get the natural sunlight to come through. Not such a bad technique, I don't think. I also put two pieces of glass together as an attempt to sandwich it, and literally held it up to the sky and let the daylight actually pass through there, and that worked pretty well. The only addition to this technique was that I realized that I was having some like see-through issues, like a lot of trees coming through, something like that. So a decent solution to that would be a piece of ground glass or a piece of fogged plastic, etched glass, whatever you happen to find. I didn't have any plastic sheeting or etched glass or anything around, so I actually made this sheet. Basically what it is, it's a piece of glass that I have done some sanding to, something like a sheet of 80 grit sandpaper. If you are a patient person, you can just slowly work that down. I actually sanded both sides of this piece of glass to really get it to fog. If you get a real close look, you can see that it's not the most even grind ever, but I found that this worked really, really well. I even sanded down the corners. That's probably not a bad idea to do anytime you're cutting glass of any kind, just to rough it down. A piece of 80 grit sandpaper is great for that, or one of these sanding sponges. Just keep in mind that the dust that you produce whenever you're sanding anything, but particularly when you're sanding glass, is not the greatest thing to be breathing. So find yourself a mask or do it outside somewhere where you're not going to have to be breathing that stuff. If you happen to have something like this, boy, that certainly makes the job a little faster. This is a random orbital sander with an 80 grit pad on there. At least that can do some real quick damage to the glass before you have to maybe do the rest by hand. So anyway, let's take a look at some of those results. Okay, so when I pulled in all of my results, both the results from the Nikon camera and from the flatbed negative scanner, I put them into a folder, and I just named the files after sort of the process that I used: 50mm, 60mm ground glass. And for a basis of comparison, I started by scanning on the Epson V600 using the provided negative holder and just kind of the built-in software. This is just going to kind of be the way that I kind of compare my results to what we're accustomed to getting in our studio. So from here, the only other experiment that I did was I scanned it using my ground glass backing, and I didn't use any of the in-scanner image editing software for this result. One of the first things I realized about, as I'm sitting here waiting for that scanner to work through its process, is like, man, this thing is slow. I scanned it at about a 2400 DPI image. It should be a nice, nice high quality image, but I forgot after doing the experiments with the Nikon camera how slow that scanner is. So let's just take a look at a couple different techniques. And we'll start with maybe the most basic one of all of them, quite literally holding the negative between two fingers and just seeing what I could get as I held it up to the sky. It was sort of a nice cloudy day today. It was the perfect kind of day to photograph negatives because there was a lot of light diffusion coming through the clouds. Obviously, my thumb is totally covering up part of the image, but I just wanted to see what I could get. I did one of those with the 50 millimeter lens and with the 60 millimeter micro. So far, I mean, I'm actually kind of impressed about like just how well they can. I totally ignored, flattening the negative. I totally ignored, image stabilization. I was just freehand holding the camera. But because I was outside, I could shoot a fast enough shutter speed, somewhere in the 200ths of a second range, that I really didn't need a tripod. When you're shooting that fast of a shutter speed, even if you got a little camera shake going on, it should be a pretty stable shot. So from there, I was in my house just trying to photograph out through the window. So with the 50 millimeter lens, photographing out through the window, not terrible. I'm going to obviously have these giant tape problems to deal with. I can kind of see where, there would have been some lightness and darkness differences, where some trees would have entered into the background, but again, totally seems to be like maybe a functional result. So then I jumped from there to sandwiching the glass, putting two pieces of glass together and sort of sandwiching the film. This solves the flatness problem, so that I wasn't accidentally going to end up, with a warping the picture. But if I wasn't careful, you can sort of see it in this image here. I was having reflection issues. If I'm not mistaken, I do believe I see my own face reflected in this negative. So that may end up sort of being an undesirable for you as we're moving forward. The 60 millimeter version, I think I can kind of, I got rid of some of that problem because of how much closer to the negative I can get. But even actually kind of looks like in this one I still may have some reflectivity issues going with that sandwich glass idea. But what I am getting here is a much flatter negative, and I'm starting to, get some of that detail from the original scans. Um, some of the some of the results I got using the cell phone photograph were interesting too. So one of the things that I noticed almost immediately was that I've got to have sort of a darkened room to make the image happen. I accidentally made some photographs with the lights on above, and the lights were being reflected in the screen of the smartphone camera. Obviously, the 50 millimeter cell phone image is further away. Each one of these 50 millimeter shots is going to be far enough away, but oh my goodness, look at all these rings in here. We'll have to talk about what's going on with some of these rings. Anytime you sort of put reflective materials up against other reflective materials, you get these things called Newtonian rings. I'm not sure if that's actually what's going on with this smartphone screen, or if it's just kind of a weird, light gradient using the app that I had, but oh my, that is not going to work very well. All these lines cutting through the negative. So it wasn't with some ugly work here. Let's pull some of these into Photoshop and take a little closer look at them. All right, so all the technical experiments aside, now let's bring these negatives into Photoshop and take a close look at what's going on. Here is the scan off the Epson V600 flatbed scanner in the sort of factory negative holder. As I would expect, it's got lots of great detail, all the little flecks and bits of dust. I forgot to clean off my negatives. I scanned it at 2400 DPI, so there's lots of great information all throughout inside the negative. I'm sure that I can end up printing a nice big file of this, but what I mostly just want to kind of look at is the overall appearance of the negative. I used the in-scanner software to do just a little bit of image correction, some unsharp mask, and what I want you to kind of pay attention to are the scanner has cropped out a little bit of the information that was on the film right around the outside. The scanner has given it sort of a crunchy black and white feel. Let's take a look at the actual file, actual image size. If I were to crop this thing down to just the actual borders of the image, let's just take a real quick look here. I want to see what what sort of, let's just call it the printability, what sort of printable image space are we dealing with? Let's go to image, image size. What did the scanner give us? Let's do sort of a standard print resolution, 300 dpi. Okay, so we're looking at, maybe a 9 by 9 inch image at 2400 dpi. That's a pretty good size image. Now let's take a look at some of these other sort of funky DIY techniques. This would be the 60 millimeter micro lens with the negative literally taped to a window. Now a 60 millimeter micro it was able to give me a pretty close-up view. So let's just take a look at the actual photograph here for a second. I must have cleaned off my negative a little bit in between pictures because I don't see quite so much dust in there. But I do see a very different structure to the sort of arrangement of the pixels. This might have been just a little bit of softness, like the 60 millimeter micro didn't focus fully on the photograph, but I just see a different sort of texture in here than I did in the flatbed scanner. That said, I got just like a bunch of other cool stuff going on in this negative that I wonder if you guys wouldn't find interesting. First of all of the kind of marginalia, all the extra stuff that comes in, the tape, the fingerprints, the film markings. Some of this got me pretty excited. I'm kind of curious about some of what happened in this process. So let's take a look at the 50 millimeter version. Very similar in that it pulled in a lot of marginalia. The actual image structure itself is very similar. When I zoom in, pretty quickly start to see that this isn't going to be quite so high resolution of an image. As I expected, there's a lot of trees in the background and other things, but I gotta say, again, very interesting. If I were merely shooting film to get extra high quality, I might consider some of this to be a disappointment. But if I'm shooting film to kind of pull out some of the kind of magic photochemical sort of fingerprints of something other than a digital sensor, there's some exciting stuff in this ripped, torn tape, fingerprint smudges on the windows kind of thing. Just for the sake of comparison, let's just take a quick look at the actual image dimensions here. This is off the 50 millimeter lens. Let's give this a quick crop and see what's left over. Image size. Right here we're at a 4 by 4 inch photograph at 300 dpi. So let's just say shooting with a 50 millimeter prime lens, I'm at about half the size of a 2400 dpi scan. Let's just see what we get with the 60 millimeter micro if we start to approach the actual scanner dimensions. Pull out all the marginalia here and do image size. Okay, we're actually at a larger printable image at this point in full resolution. Who'd have thought? So a 120 negative photographed with a 60 millimeter micro is producing so larger printable images. Cool. And let's take a look at some other stuff. So the ground glass. The ground glass gave me a much more even lighting all the way across the back of this negative. What I lost in the ground glass version of this photograph would be all of this sort of interesting marginalia around the sides, but what I got, I think, is a fairly clean image. In this one in particular, I think I got a very nice structure to the actual photograph itself. The 60 millimeter picked up a very sharp image. I think this rivals the scanner, if not even a little bit sharper than the scanner. I might have to get a little closer on that one, but really nice quality image. And now let's jump over into some really messy DIY stuff, the cell phones. So the cell phone did some interesting stuff too to this image. So let's take a look at the structure of the image itself. I noticed almost immediately this sort of strange grid in the background of the negative. Maybe you can see it here. I suppose that could be part of the way that the smartphone screen is backlit. This was photographed with the, let's see here, I believe this one was the 60 millimeter. Yeah, so even with the 60 millimeter micro, I still got some of that banding kind of cutting through the photograph. You can see it here. In terms of the kind of strange marginalia, there's some interesting framing stuff going on here at the sides. It's not too bad. I would expect that the printable image of this would be analogous to the other 60mm lens, so I'm not going to mess with that. The 50mm smartphone, the one that had the really bad banding, um, came out looking actually not so bad. I'm sort of surprised. In terms of the marginalia, I gotta say that this is kind of cool. I could come up with all kinds of very interesting photo projects based on what I see here with the sort of frame within a frame photograph with the negative. We've got sort of this backwards forwards photographic history, lens-based art, digital imaging thing going on. So uh, yeah, as much as it's sort of strange and really crude DIY stuff, I kind of like it. All right, let's go for like super crude. I literally held my negative up with my bare hands up to the sky and photographed it. I was frankly shocked at the quality of not only the negative scan, the digitized negative here. I mean, that's pretty reasonable considering I was putting my greasy fingers all over the negative here. But in terms of interesting marginalia, there's something wonderful about a photochemical image being held by fleshy negative fingers. I got to say that for all of these sort of strange DIY techniques, each one comes with its own set of weird possibilities. Um, I'm going to do one quick demo here at the end of how I was able to flip and invert some of these negatives. Let's just pull in the 60mm window and tape. So since I shot these files in RAW, they will, when I do a Command O, open right into RAW. The only edit I did in RAW was I converted it to black and white. I'm not going to mess with any of these sliders here because basically everything you do you have to invert in your head, and don't think I'm up for that. So I'm going to open this image and I'll do all of my negative work in here, and I'm going to use adjustment layers. So the half black, half white circle at the bottom of your layers palette, open that up, grab first of all your levels adjustment, and down here under your output levels I want you to grab onto your black slider, and we'll just kind of slide that all the way up to the top, grab onto the white slider, bring that all the way down to the bottom, basically inverting your output levels. This more or less inverts the negative to make it a positive image. And there are a couple of weird reasons why we might do this, a couple of alternate reasons. I sort of like this technique of manipulating levels because it gives you some sort of custom editing. If you wanted to adjust your midtone brightness at this point, you could. I'm going to leave mine right where it is for a second and maybe come back to it. I'm going to open up now a second levels adjustment. And with this levels adjustment, I'm going to make sure that I set sort of my kind of cutoff points. Now it looks like I'm just missing a whole bunch of information here, and truthfully I am. And so what I could do is eyeball this in, but I find this keyboard shortcut to be pretty handy. Press and hold Option or Alt on your keyboard, and as soon as you start to see the shadows coming in, back it off. You want to kind of set that cutoff point just before your shadows come in. Something like that. And now I'll open up a curves palette and give it our standard contrast S curve. Pull it down just a little bit to brighten the whites. Pull it up a little bit to darken the shadow areas. And at this point, customizing those curves. I think my whites got a little bit too bright, so I'm going to soften those out a little bit. Maybe the blacks could get a little bit darker. And then I might just add one more curves layer to this image and adjust how bright the lower part of the photograph has gotten. Somewhere in there looks about right. And I want to use my layer mask to kind of open this area up. The fastest way is, since this is almost a perfect diagonal line here, I'll grab my gradient tool and just make a very kind of down and dirty gradient. You'll see in the layer mask up here that gradient automatically lays in. I could have hand brushed that in, but for this purpose I'm just going to kind of leave that be. So a couple of levels, one to invert the negative, one to adjust the sort of cutoff points, one to add an S-curve contrast, and a little bit of exposure editing. That's not bad for a negative scanning technique or a negative digitizing technique that only took a minute or two outside, taped to the window. I'm excited to see what you guys come up with.